Thank you.
We're good to go.
Well, thank you very much. Welcome everybody back to, I guess, our impromptu sessions, as you might call it. So today's talk, we're going to be talking about one criteria for decision making. Now, I posted the PROACT part again. And the reason I did is because you'll see how we can use that, but depending on the criteria you want to use, you'll be able to set up. And I'm going to write a note real quick because I did not put down for the decision criteria. What if we don't get it for next one? Anyway, but the reason I mention this is because we're going to be focusing on one class that I teach at Pomona, and that's in economic decision making. It's actually called, it's the IME 4030, and the name of the class is economic considerations in technological decision making, or something like that. But the course is IME 4030. It's offered every semester and also in the summer. It goes towards your GEs. It'll be under, I believe, it's under C and D, but I think that you would want it under D because C can be covered by your senior project. So if you want to use it for your D general ed, it's a good class to take, very useful. And again, I didn't realize how useful it was until I started teaching it actually. Even when I was taking it as an undergrad, I didn't particularly care for it. But as I started teaching, I started seeing more and more the implications. And I'm one of those people that now believes that it probably would be a good, along with decision-making theory, actually would be a good class for engineers, if and only if, to be able to tell the people with the purse strings about why they should be listening to you. So for example, if some of you were here before we started, I was talking about the story about one of my former students that was working for one of those prepackaged salad companies. And he was noticing that the bags that they used to store some of the greens were a bit big. And so he started experimenting and realized they could cut off about 6 inches from the top of the bag, if I remember correctly. And after doing some economic analysis, the way he justified cutting off 6 inches was to say that it was to do the computations, and found out that they would get about $100,000 per month, if I remember correctly, just by reducing the size of the bag. And the reason I mention these things is because it doesn't have to just be in regular companies. I've done it. For example, I had one example with students where I had them look at the issue of incarceration. Now, for those of you that don't know, incarceration is actually a very interesting topic to me and part of my research. I'm not researching as much as I used to, but I still find it very fascinating because in general, it's amazing to me how, if you know the history of it, we've incarcerated much more people since the 1970s. And not only do we incarcerate much more, the number of incarcerated per, I believe it's the things per 100,000 people, is higher in the US with the exception of maybe China. And so we incarcerate there's about 2 to 2.3 million people in the prison system at different levels throughout this country. But what's interesting about it is that there's a problem called recidivism rates. And recidivism basically is how often do people go back? And depending on what you look at, usually it's defined by the percentage of incarcerated people that are released after serving their term who return back to prison within 3 years. And some maybe make it a little bit less, but the numbers were astronomical for a long time. And the state of California was almost like 63%, I believe it was. In other parts of the country, it was 60s as well. But the reason I had my students look at it is because I said, if we just put it down to an economic analysis, let's ask ourselves, is there a cheaper way? Because you have to understand that it costs, depending again on the state, it costs anywhere from $20,000, $25,000 per year per inmate to up to and above $100,000 per year per inmate, depending on the age as well. And basically, it's what's called a sunk cost. And what that means is that you're just paying money into it and getting nothing back, really. There's some might say, well, you're protecting the population. But the reality is you're paying money to put people in a place, and basically it's not self-sustaining, because one of the problems with California was in the mid 2000s, they were overpopulating, and it's not cheap to build a prison because you have to put a lot of infrastructure in. And then not only that, as the population gets older, they're starting to have to worry about medical issues. And there's a whole bunch of dynamics to it. But the point was, when I asked my students to look at it as a project, they were finding that if you just change the system a little bit, so you teach them maybe how to do manual labor, so like auto mechanic, heating and cooling, HVAC, plumbing, being a chef, solar power installations, things like that. We were finding that it actually saves the state and other facilities, because they're both federal, and there's federal, state, and private. We were seeing that the cost actually was, in savings value, was upwards of millions of dollars per inmate, given the time frame usually that they stay in. And so we were thinking that it's probably cheaper to teach them to keep out of prison than it is to let them keep going in. There's a whole bunch of dynamics to it, but looking at an economic model, it was cheaper actually to teach them to learn some of these skills than it was to just keep them in prison as they normally did, because the recidivism rate for those that learned a skill just plummeted to the teens. So it gives you an idea of how thinking a little bit more creatively can help you solve problems. But that was because the problem was, we said not just keep them in, but what is the issue of incarceration, which is, why are these people committing these crimes? Why are they being violent, et cetera? And then I applied it to different ones. I was talking about what's called the Chaka system. I have one where we talk about what happens if we use, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the avocado issue and the drug cartels in Mexico. Are any of you familiar with that?
A little bit.
So if just a quick summary on that. In the past 5 years, a lot of the drug cartels in Mexico have shifted to avocados, because they've noticed that the US population has been getting a lot of avocados. And so they basically hijack all the avocado plantations over in Mexico, particularly I believe it's in Zacatecas, which is near Jalisco, which is down towards the southwest of Mexico, if I remember correctly. But the point was that they were hijacking basically the plantations and growing them, and so they were diversifying themselves. And the same thing goes with narco trafficking, in that like Colombian drug lords are very much like supply chain management and businesses in the US, like Walmart. So the idea was, we're looking at, is there economic viability where maybe we can change things? Because I know that, like, for example, in the Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia, there's a coffee company that I remember reading about and studying a little bit. And then what they did is a villager who was there was fortunate to go out and study, and he brought back the idea of making coffee making business, because it could be grown there rather than growing opium through poppies. So again, it came down to the economic decision making. I mean, there's a dynamic, obviously, but very, very many of criminal activity has a monetary value on it. So we looked at the value of how we can reduce that. But to go back to what we were talking about, I mean, regardless of the problem that we're facing with the PROAC model, now the idea here is to figure out some certain economic concerns. And one of the big things that we deal with, you can see my screen, correct?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, good. Is this issue right here, what's called the time value of money. Now, an easy way to understand time value of money is, I'm assuming all of you have some type of credit card or some type of student loan or something like that. Yeah, yes, no.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you have a credit card, I think you're aware that a credit card is basically a 1 month loan interest free, correct? Did you realize that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing is, time value comes to I mean, for that month, if you don't pay it, then they will start charging interest. That's called the time value of money. And particularly the value of it is based upon what the interest is that they charge you. So when we do things in engineering economics, we ask ourselves, what is the time value of money whenever we look at a certain amount of value? So we're always asking ourselves something about what's called the capital cost. And so the thing is that we'll have what's called a capital cost. And a capital cost is basically any type of multi-year value item that we want to use to start a business. So one example I use in class is an Uber driver. So let's say that you came to Cal Poly Pomona, you're in your freshman year, and you say, you know what, I want to make some money being an Uber driver. But you say, you know what, I need to get a vehicle. So a capital cost could be the cost of a vehicle. So let's say you get a Prius or whatever you have like that. That is a capital cost. And you'll see that the reason why that's important is because there are many implications with that. Now, when you buy the car, it's called a capital cost, but it's also known as a present worth. So like, for example, if you go out, like, let's go check it out. So if I wanted to buy a 2021 Prius, so let's see. Evans has so it's going to be somewhere between 24,525 and 32,650, depending on what we get in the Prius. But the point is that the cost for the Prius right now is somewhere in that range. So let's say that, notice how it says the MSRP is 262. So let's round off to 26 grand for a capital cost. Now, given the capital cost, and given the fact that's a present worth, we can ask ourselves one question, okay? What else do we need to include to make sure that we understand what this is costing us when we do it? Okay, so like, what are some of the things that go into, if you have a car, I mean, you have to buy it, obviously. What else do you have for a car?
Insurance.
Insurance, okay. Other
License
things.
plates?
License plates, tax and license. Other things?
Yes.
Fuel, correct.
Maintenance costs, if there's an issue with the car you bought, gotta fix
Was that
it.
again? Sorry?
Maybe maintenance costs, if there's a problem with the car, you gotta fix it.
Okay, maintenance, you actually have regular maintenance often. So these are just some of the things that you're going to have. So the capital cost for a car will be the purchase price, but you also have other values there, such as tax and license, fuel, and maintenance. Now, these are all costs. Now, when we have these costs, we also have things that are benefits. So what are some of the benefits do you think if I'm being an Uber driver?
You get paid.
Exactly. You get a fare. Okay, so let's just keep it simple. Let's say that's the main value that we got. But notice, we bought the car, but we know that the car is going to cost us for the value of the insurance, the tax and license, fuel, maintenance, but we also get the benefit of the fares. So what we can do is we can say the following. We have something called a present worth. So we know that the first part is car cost. Now we also know that we can offset that with the benefits. So we have any benefits minus the car cost, and we're going to call it incidentals, okay? Incidental costs. Now, notice something. The benefits themselves Are they all in the same time, or are they over a period of time?
They're over a period of time, right?
Right. So the thing is, money changes value over time, given the fact that we have to pay, like, for example, if you buy the car, you would have to pay an interest value for buying the car, unless you buy the car outright, correct?
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what you pay for. You usually people pay some type of monthly payment, which includes the finance charges and other things for paying for the car. So what happens is, in those cases, we have what's called a uniform value. So any benefits has to be multiplied by the TVOM of, and that's called a uniform. And the reason why I call it uniform, I'll call it AV. I'm going to use AV. Just know that AV goes back to this one here. I'll call it AW. I usually use AW. Now, let me explain why this is important. Now, you know that let's say that you're going to drive the car for, let's say you plan on taking 5 years to go to finish up your degree. And so you say, I'm going to be doing this for 5 years. So that means you're going to get 5 years worth of benefits, right?
Right.
Okay. But you also know that you also are going to have to pay 5 years of incidentals. So the idea behind this is that when we buy a car, we'll also have other values with it. And that'll be also a value that we need to consider. Now, I'm going to go to the page I talked about, which is this one. Now, what all these do basically is help us understand what is the time value of money in a given time period. Now, I'm going to help you demystify some of this so you understand it's not too problematic to understand the basics. It takes a while to get how to put them together. But for example, what this says here, convert, this is saying if I want to get a future value from a value right now for an interest rate, I use this formula. If I want to look at a future value and figure out what it would be worth in a time period now, I would use this value, which is called the present worth. These four here, A given F, A given P, F given A, and P given A, these are part of what's called the uniform series. And what those are developed to do are simply to show you what is the value of a recurring value, like a monthly payment. So let me give you a representation that might help. Okay. Oh, shoot, I thought this one had it. I'm incorrect. Let me get the other one really quick. But as I get it, just know that what happens is that when you do this, what you're basically doing is you're saying, I want to know what the values of these are to me, given the fact that they're different time periods, because I need to make sure they're all in the same time period. Because, like, for example, and this goes beyond just simple interest, but for example, $100 now is definitely worth a very different amount than, let's say, $100 10 years ago, even, correct? Yes,
Yeah.
no, maybe. Part of it is inflation, but other things are just simply that, for whatever reason, when I have an item and it costs me $100 now, it changes value. So what we do is we incorporate those values using whatever interest rate we got. Now, this is a simple example. It's called a cash flow diagram. And the idea is basically on the first two I mentioned, either it's present or it's a future value. Now, present value is exactly what it sounds like, right now. But for every period in which the compounding occurs, which is basically the value of the interest, we keep adding an amount to it. So I'm assuming that you guys have seen on your statement where it says if you pay the minimum payment, you'll pay in 125 years. You guys seen those?
Yeah, I've seen those.
Yeah. That's what they're looking at. They're saying that we have this interest rate that's accumulated on your card. And so we're basically only paying a lot. We're paying a lot of the interest rate, but only a little bit of the principal. And the principal is typically what you pay for at the very beginning. So if you go out, spend $100, you use your card to get the $100, they're giving you $100 worth of value, but the card is promising to pay for you with the promise that you'll pay them back plus the interest amount, because they're giving you the privilege, so they say, of paying for that value at a longer rate of period. That's why they have things like car payments or house payments, because few and far between are people who are able to spend 26 grand on a car just by giving 26 grand, or given the current market in California, $500,000 and more, to be able to pay an entire amount. And so while this is the future value of that, we also have what's called a recurring or repeated cash flow. And these are represented by series of A values. Now, the reason why they call them A is because they stand for what's called annuities. And you have to understand this particular branch of study is fairly mature. And so this is going before calculators were out. You probably had to use things like just not roster books, but columnated tables. And you had to also use table values. So you go to a book, find the values of the value we're looking for. And often it was just easier to do it in annual values rather than using continuous, what we use now. But the point is all this, that this one right here represents what I was talking about when I got this one here. So when we're talking about these as being recurring, it's talking about having these values keep recurring and figuring out what it would be in now dollars. So let me give you this idea. Okay, so let's say that, just for the sake of argument, let's say we pay the 26 grand, or let's say we pay $10,000. We got a good trade in, or someone gave us money free of charge. We'll make it 20. Okay, so $20,000. So they say, okay, we'll give you the car for $20,000, but you're going to pay us over 36 months, including interest, this value. That's what's happening here. You get a present worth of the car, but what's called, well, I forget the term. Why am I forgetting the term? Let me get over here. Capital recovery. There, why can't I remember? So you're basically recovering the capital, or they're recovering the capital from you by getting an annual payment. So that's one way of looking at it. From this one, you're saying, I bought the car. I am going to have a certain number of benefits over the period of time. I also have a certain number of costs, and that should be costs there. So what is the value of the cost to me now? Okay, so that's one of the words. We call it present worth. So are there questions so far on present worth? I know this is very whirlwind, and if I could, I'd teach you probably 2 of these days, but we'll see how this goes. But are you understanding what present worth is in this case?
Yeah. I
Okay.
believe so.
Everybody okay with present worth so far? Show of thumbs or frowns. Okay, good. Nicholas. Okay. Sandra, are you okay?
Yes.
Okay. So we could look at these cars and say, you know what? Okay, we're expecting to make this much of money every single week. We're expecting to pay this amount of money every single year. And so what we do is we put them all together, and including the value of how much we're going to pay for the car itself over these times. And so we end up with a value that's a present worth. So you could say, if I pay $100 per month, that is going to be $1,200 times any type of the effective interest rate we're going to have for that entire year, minus any cost. And the present worth you'll get is the value of the car, the value of all the benefits put together, including interest rate, and the value of all the cost together with the interest rate. And so then what you would do is called a present worth analysis. And what all the present worth analysis does, it says, take a whole bunch, find out which is the best one. So you could take it and say on any card, say, well, I have a Prius that I can go for. Or maybe I can go for, go for higher end. Because I remember one time I had a project where they wanted to rent out. If you guys ever seen how, I think in Vegas, they do it a lot, where they would rent out a supercar if you wanted to drive it for like an hour and they would let you go on a test track. You guys ever hear about that?
Yes.
Mhm.
So they were looking at what would have the best value for that. So they got a present worth, and I forget which one they did, but basically what you can do is you can look at and say, of all these cars, this one appears to give us the best value for what we're anticipating. Now, yes, they're estimates, and that's another part of the class. And I usually only talk about those estimates in terms of how to make really good estimates in my master's class, but we talk a little bit about it in class. Now, with that is also the future worth. Now, future worth is not talked about as much, simply because what the future worth is basically is any worth, maybe a present worth, times the TVOM, but for the present worth. And what it does is it goes forward into the future. So for example, let's say that you wanted to put money in a bank and you want to see how much money you would have in the future, you could use a future worth. It isn't used as much for economic analysis. And the reason is because it's not as intuitive. Present worth is, this is my money, this is how much it would cost altogether, and this is the equivalent value because let's say if I have, again, as I mentioned, we bought the $26,000 car plus the interest, the value of the car in terms of its cost to us will be 26 plus whatever interest. Makes sense because that's how much money you have. Future worth, again, it's usually used more for like retirement funds. So like, let's say if any of you were thinking about retiring, you would use something like what's called F given A, this value right here. And what that would do is it would say, okay, if I were to put in $500 per year for the next 10 years, or let's say for the next 25 years, because I anticipate only being with the company for 25 years, what would I get out of it? That's an F given A value. Or if I wanted to see how much, if I just left some money in the bank, that would be an F given P value. The point of the future values is simply, if I'm thinking about investing, how much would I get out at the end of that investment period? Again, it's not very used a lot in terms of a lot of businesses because most prefer to say the present worth, and they'd rather convert the future to a present worth because you don't know for certain in a future worth. Now, another one that now again, the only thing you do with a present worth and a future worth, and we'll see also with uniform and the like, is you just ask which one gives you more money or which one costs less. So for example, I say about the car. So let's say I put down, again, a Prius versus Hyundai. I'm not sure, I can't remember any of the Hyundai models right now, and I find out that the Prius in its total with all the value of the cost, all the benefits, the cost of the car, that's worth 10 grand to me right now. Versus, let's say the Sonata, I guess, that gives me $7,000, including the incidentals and costs, all equivalent. It's better for me to go to the Prius because the Prius makes me more money. So all you do when you do a present worth analysis or even future worth is say, which one gives me more money or which one costs the least? And that's usually got like government projects or repairing something where you might say, okay, it's going to cost, one will cost 1.5 million and one will cost 2 million. I'd rather go with the 1.5 million because it's cheaper. But again, that is just pure monetary concern because there are other factors that often go into these things. But this is one of the more prevalent ones that you see, which is called present and future worth economic worths. Okay. And they're also called equivalent worth. But the big point is you can take all the monies from all the periods of time and just kind of condense them down to a single number. And in fact, let me show you a representation of that. There we go. So you basically condense them all to a single number. This is unfortunately an F given P, so let's give you an F. Yeah, here we go. So you condense them down to a single number and ask yourself, how much is it worth? So in this case, we're saying that you have a machine that has $5,000. It's going to last for 5 years. It's got 8% in terms of how much we're expecting this investment to give us. So what we're saying is, in this case, that its equivalent is used for $1,252. Now, unfortunately, that is a, well, actually, let's see. Where's my PDF? I'll just leave it there. Okay, so in addition to this one, we can also ask ourselves, if I have these values from now, what is the value if I'm looking at a regular cost value? So let's say I take the Uber driver cost again. And what I might ask myself is, okay, I anticipate that I'm going to make this amount of money per month. I anticipate I'm going to pay this amount of money in insurance, in fuel, maintenance, and the like. And so I want to know, how much can I afford to spend in order to make it worth my while? Because obviously you want to make money. So let's say that what you do is you take the value of the car, and then instead of doing what we did before, so I'll just take this one, it's probably easier. So we say is, okay, I know what my benefits are going to be, but I want something else because I want this to tell me how much is it I'm going to be having to pay per month. So I'll give you an example right now, but it's a TV with a PM and these don't need to be $8. Okay. This is a very, very simple way of showing it. So instead of going back to this, what we're saying is, I want to know what is it equivalent to me per month. So let's say, for example, I know I'm going to have a certain car payment. I want to know, given my car payment, what is the minimum amount of money I need to make per month in order to be making money? Because if I'm not going to make money per month, why do I want to be an Uber driver? So to do that, what you do is you take the present value of the item, the capital cost, which is the car, and you find an annual worth of that, or what's called a uniform series of value, which is actually the car payment. And then you add together both the benefits and costs and ask yourself, am I making money or not per month? Now, again, that makes more sense if I'm looking at it from a monthly perspective, because that's my operating time. And it's another fairly common one because people want to know, should I be engaged in this idea or not? Particularly if you already have an existing process. Now, example I use in my classes, let's say that I want to install a surveillance system, and let's say it's a warehouse. So let's say in this warehouse, I already have security details. So these are people being paid by cost of the value of their salary. So what I could do is say, okay, how much are they making in salary per week or per month or whatever you want to do? You say, okay, it's costing that. So let's say that I want to anticipate, and this is actually interesting because you'll see a lot, I think you'll see this a lot more as we get more automation, is you ask yourself, what is the cost of automating that whole security process? So maybe installing security cameras or as they're doing with robots, things like that. That is why you would use a uniform cost, because usually then you start looking at operating cost per day, or per week at least, and sometimes per day. And so let's say that you're currently paying, minimum wage. I forget the minimum wage value right now, it depends on the state, obviously. And you realize the cost, that you can ask yourself one or two questions. The first is, what is the maximum amount I can spend to buy something that replaces this machine, or replaces the security detail? Or what is the maximum amount I can afford to spend per month in order to make sure that I at least have the equivalent of what they're doing now? That's usually what you use for uniform series. Again, it's usually used for when you already have established processes, and that's why they're often used. Other than that, again, usually present work is done first. So any questions before I continue? The clarifications or observations? No?
I think everyone's good so far.
Okay. The last one, let's just say that this one right here, the gradient, that's if you're increasing values or decreasing values. So we have both geometric and arithmetic. I'm not going to go too much into gradient because it takes a while to explain. But let's just say that if you had examples where, like for example, this one here. This is an arithmetic rate. So let's say you had a value that keeps going up regularly. The other one we use is also what's called the geometric rate. This one's actually used more, at least in my experience, used more. So if, like, for example, if you ever had to, one great example, and a student pointed this out last spring. She was working and she had to figure out whether or not to buy a new car, or to get a new car, or to get rid of her old car. And what she was noticing was that the value of the maintenance for her old car was increasing a lot, almost geometrically. And so she realized that the value of the value she was projecting for keeping the car for a period of time versus getting a new, or pre-owned, certified pre-owned, was actually more expensive than getting a new car. And this type of calculation is typically made toward end of life. So, like, again, I'll use the car because that's probably the most accessible. So I'm sure many of you have had a car. The car does great for the first several years, depending on how much mileage you put on it. And then at some point you start noticing that you're doing more maintenance to it. Well, that's why you use the gradient series, because that value of the car, the maintenance, keeps increasing. Or maybe it's the cost of how much gas, your fuel you're using. But the point is, these are used typically when you have to deal with values that are not stable, that they're changing over time period. And again, the idea behind that is allows you at the end of the day to be able to go back and ask yourself, what is this equivalent, either in a uniform value or present worth? So for example, when they talked about the car, let's say that you want to say, well, maybe you already have a car. And so, well, should I use this car or should I get a new one? So you can ask, okay, like, what's any changes? Well, I'm noticing I'm having to spend more to get it. I'm spending more time in the shop. So maybe you want to look at the increase in terms of the maintenance fees and figure out the additional maintenance fees with the current cost I'm looking for. How much is that going to be worth versus buying a new car? You may find out that it's cheaper actually than a newer pre-owned car than it is to continue on with maintenance costs. And that's typically where gradients come in. Now, all of these are exactly as they said. They're based on dollar values. Now, going back to the reason why we're looking at these things. So let's say, for example, let's say you want to get fresh water for town. I remember one time that's one thing that was being done. And the problem was that they were having difficulty figuring out how to get said water to this town correctly. So let's say, you know what, we're going to buy them a pump. Well, a pump is going to cost you money to get it, to buy it. Well, if you find out that the pump does not have the electricity needed, you're going to figure out, okay, how do we get electricity to get this pump working? So you might have to buy, in addition to that, solar cells. As we were talking about, maybe batteries, or maybe you're going to use redundancy, and maybe they're able to use wind power. But the point is that you would either have to figure out, okay, what's the initial cost, but what are the other incidentals of keeping this pump going? Do I need to worry about maintenance? Do I need to worry about other aspects? Maybe if I get an energy grid in there, what's it going to cost me to maintain said energy grid? What's going to maintain this to keep the solar cells going? How often? What's with reliability? Although we don't talk too much about that today. But the point is that if you put the solution wherever you're using it, you have to ask yourself, what are the other things that are going to go into it, and how long do I anticipate? And sadly, one of the things that has really done a lot against solar cells for the longest time has been the value of energy received versus the value paid in to make that energy available. Now, again, it depends on where you're doing it, because as we mentioned, it'd be better, putting it probably in Seattle is not a good option versus putting it somewhere sunny like California, Southern California or Arizona and the like. But the point is that when you look at all those values, you can make an estimate either of the present worth or a uniform series and figure out, is the cost of this even positive or not? Because you find that's negative versus what they're doing now, maybe you want to reconsider how you do it. And that's one of the reasons why I was thinking of, I wasn't particularly thinking about this factor, but this is one factor we'd use to figure out, is this a good investment for us to put there? And in fact, for you all, one thing you could do is, if you're looking for funding, if you have something like this calculation available, it might allow you to show why they should donate to you, in one form or another. Including, you could say, hey, if you donate this item, this is the tax implications by which you can consider if you donate to us. So having the type of equivalent worth or uniform series of whatever value you want. And if you guys want, I'll be more than happy to teach you how to do this using Excel. But my point in this part was, if you go out for seeking donations or funding, you can use something like this to be able to explain why what you're doing is feasible. Now, some just donate because they donate, but a lot of times if you have just even a simple calculations, they'll probably say, wow, you actually know what's going on. So yeah, we will donate to you, and maybe you can tell us, what would be the implications, or let us donate it outright. Okay, and that's basically just based on pure dollar values. Now, two other common ones. In fact, I'll talk about payback period first. The discounted payback period is simply a calculation of how long am I going to get my investment? So let me ask this question. If I were to tell you that I have a payback period of 3 years, good or bad?
It depends, right? On
I'm glad you noticed
the
that.
value.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you noticed that, Zachary. If I were to say to pay back on making a new cell phone line, would 3 years be good or bad?
That'd be not that good, because they come out with a new phone every year. So
Exactly.
your phone would be outdated in 2 years, might be outdated.
Exactly. Probably 3-year return on payback period for a cell phone line, probably way too long and not worthwhile. If I were to say a payback period of 3 years for, let's say, a bridge, what do you think? Sound better?
Sounds a lot better.
Yeah, because bridges last 30, 40, 50 years. So see, that's why payback period can be very useful, because you can say to someone, okay, if you give us this item, if you donate to us, you have tax, you can write it off in your taxes. We anticipate that the value to them, the people that we're using it for, will be $10,000 per year because they don't have to bring, let's say, like you said, the water pump, they don't have to have it carted in using water trucks. We also anticipate that we'll have the payback on the pump, the value of the pump at least, within 3 years, and we anticipate that this will be working for 10. So now you say, hey, the first third of that time period, you're paying out, but then after you start making money back. So that's why these can be useful, because when you're talking with people to get the funding, showing them that you understand the monetary cost can be one way in which you'll show this is why you should go with us. And when you guys get out into the work world, depending on what you're doing, like Nicholas, you were talking about chemistry, you might say, hey, you know what, boss, if we use this different process for these or these different chemicals, you get the same basic principles, but it's going to cost you, I don't know, $1 less per cubic meter of material that we use or whatever. But it's going to save us this amount over 10 years. We're anticipating using it, which is maybe, I don't know, may say $1 million for whatever reason. I think that they would be very favorable to that. Or like in aviation, I was talking about the SR-71 yesterday. If they were able to do the same thing, let's say with carbon composites, which may or may not work, it may depend on the type of composite, and it costs them less than the SR-71, then maybe you would go that route. But the point is, when you put it into monetary values or payback period, you're showing them this is the advantage of doing what we're doing. Now, I wanted to just go an hour with this, but I'll finish up with this one, rate of return. What the rate of return basically is how much do you get for the amount that you put in? It's basically a rate, an interest rate, percentage. Now, it's a little bit tricky to put in, but the basics of this is as follows. For every dollar that I put into an investment, you want to ask how many dollars or how much more am I getting out of the investment? So for example, if I spend $1 and I get $1.50 out of every dollar that I invest, I make 50 cents per dollar spent. Okay, so 150%, not bad. I'm making money back. That is what the rate of return does for us. Now, there's a big process called incremental rate of return that we also talk about. But the difference between rate of return and time value or equivalent worths is that the equivalent worths are just pure dollar values. But the rate of return tells you how much for the amount of investment I'm making, how much more am I making or not. So it is possible to make money but not have a good rate of return. So for example, it's interesting. Were any of you guys hearing about the cryptocurrency over the year? How it changed?
The Bitcoin.
Right. Like Dogecoin, did you guys hear about that?
Yeah.
Okay. Some of you have, good. Some people were literally buying Dogecoins for pennies on the dollar. And I think some people actually got even lesser, but really got in early. And then when Dogecoin hit like 35 cents per Dogecoin, some people made like millions of dollars off that. Or for those that invested early, if you hear all things about Bitcoin and Ethereum, people that got in early, let's say, I think Bitcoin came in close to $1 when it started, but they're now making per dollar that they put in, they made like $30,000 in some cases, depends on when you got in. The point of rate of return is how much power am I buying back for every dollar that I put in? And so that's why we talk about it. And the simple way you do it is you take the cost, you equate that equal to the benefit, and then find out at what percentage do I get that value back. And that's simply what rate of return is. So I guess what you can take from today's talk is, one, what is the equivalent value for everything I put into an investment so that I can talk about how much it's worth to me at a given time period. Two, for every dollar I invest, how much money do I get back on it? And it doesn't have to be dollar, it can be any currency you want. And 3, how long does it take me to get my return, my investment back? Because depending on what type of venture it is, sometimes what may seem very short time may be too long, and sometimes what may seem long time may be very short, depending on the investment. So questions or clarifications that you'd like?
I have a question.
Great, Clyde.
So say I want to replace my security guy with a security camera.
Mhm.
And I know that a security camera will be much more consistent in doing its job, but there isn't like a numerical value for consistency. So do we just assign a value to that, like a weighted value, so we can compare them when we're
Okay.
doing this beneficial analysis?
Yes, you can. It's called, what you're calling is valuation. Oddly enough, the best example of valuation would be in amusement parks or sporting events, because if any of you have gone to any sporting event or amusement park, you'll note that, like, especially Disney, you'll notice that what usually would cost you less than $1 at a Costco or even at a liquor store is going to cost you $5 to $10 in those venues, right?
Yes.
So what you do is you'd have to figure out you have to basically figure out what you would consider the cost. You have to figure out, I'm sorry, I'm just putting this in here because I don't want to forget to give it to you guys. You have to figure out what the cost is versus the area in which you're doing it, because you can change the value by that. But usually you can find commodities that will help you put the value to it. So there are ways to do it, but like again, you have to figure out, like, let me give you an example, real quick one. So let's say I have to figure out, do I want a vehicle, so I go to Cal Poly Pomona, or can I do public transportation? So maybe one way to see how much it's worth just taking public transportation in terms of viewing or value of time, you can use minimum wage. So let's say it takes you an hour to get to Cal Poly Pomona using public transportation, but it takes you 20 minutes using a car. You can basically look at the difference in terms of the wage value. So you would say, okay, how much money am I losing driving in the car versus going on some type of public transportation? Now, yes, you might say, well, yeah, but if I drive, I have to worry about this factor and that factor. You can put a value on that if you like. But again, it takes a little bit of skill and time. And that's why I recommended that book from yesterday, because it talks a lot about that. But if you want to talk about it more, if you want to set up some time, we can talk about it.
Thank you.
Others? Mark, I know you're here. I'm not sure which one to use.
The first one is right.
Okay. I'm sending you my notes, the share link for my notes, so you guys can have them already. Sorry, I didn't want to forget that, because I wanted to do it now, otherwise I'd forget it. I know I'd forget it. Other questions, or I mean, even if it's related to projects that you guys are thinking about for EWB. I can give you a great example of something similar if you like.
Sure. I'd love to hear it.
Okay, this is, I'll never forget this example, because there was a Catholic priest I met one time, and he was actually very smart and savvy. Okay, Zachary, don't worry, problem. Thank you. Actually, he's already gone. But anyway, but what happened with this priest was the following. He was building a school in Uganda for a lot of the children in the area, because he was in an area that the kids needed education. And so what he would do is, whenever he made, because he he studied in the US. So whenever he would go to the US, back to where he was at, he would always have a list of items they needed for the school and the areas that they were building for it. And he'd always have a value of what was needed, because and on top of that, he also had pictures every time the past editions were included. So like, for example, I think the first thing he built was a primary school. And so what he did is he estimated based upon the cost of building the school there, and he put a dollar value on it, and he would tell people, well, I need this amount to be able to build this, and he had it broken down. And very smartly, what he did is he'd get the donations, go back, and they'd get it done. He'd take pictures, and he'd come back the following year, and then he'd show them, this is what we got done. This is what our next plan was. So I think the next thing he did was a middle school. And so what he kept doing was he kept going on showing what was the outcome with the associated dollar values. Now, he didn't go quite so much into rate of return, but in a sense, when he showed what came out of it, the actual physical buildings, he was able to show this is what your return is on the money you donated. He can actually, you could have put a value to it by having someone give an assessment, a value to that building or whatever. And he built, I think correctly, he built an elementary school, a middle school, a high school. He built dormitories because some of the kids had to come from very far. He was able to get a well dug with pumping station. So he was able to, over, I think, a period of about 10 years, he got a lot done. And it was amazing to see how he did it, because he realized very, very astutely that if you show people what they're getting on the return, they're more likely to invest, in this case, donate. But it's the same thing for anything that we do. That, you know, if we ever go for donations or the like, we can say, hey, this is what we got done. This is the result. This is what we estimate the values are like. This is what we've estimated the return is like. They got this payback period. So they'll see that the values of whatever you're trying to do in terms of humanitarian work works. And in fact, that's why they call it social engineering. And in fact, in the US, there's something called a B Corp. And a B Corp is basically a company that allows you to both make a profit, but under the stipulation that for every building that you, or every company you make a profit on, you have to make an equivalent one in an area that is less, what's the word they used for it officially? But basically areas that were impoverished. So like, for example, I knew a friend that was building a wellness clinic in South Central LA. And they went B Corp, and they built the area there. Unfortunately, it didn't go as well as they wanted to, because they were intended to go from there to a higher end location. And so that would be under the B Corp. But again, the idea behind all this is that if you can put values to whatever we do, it might be useful when you're trying to get donations from different companies, or even to show that what you actually do in terms of EWB. Others? Questions? Was this useful?
It was useful. I might have a question. Let's say that there's something that I want to invest in, but the initial investments are like really, really high.
Mhm.
And in order to get out of the red, it would take a number of years. But
Mhm.
once I'm out of the red, basically it's like a self-sufficient business. So once production is up and running, I would be making profit, but it would just take a really long time to actually set up.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. If I understand what you're talking about correctly, Nicholas, let me rephrase it so I understand. Okay. So you want to have this business, but you anticipate it's going to take a number of years before it starts turning a profit. And so how would you go about that, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Okay, one thing I didn't talk about was called after-tax cash flows. This was all primarily focused on what's called before-tax cash flows. After-tax cash flows starts looking at the value of the items that are used, basically the benefits and costs that you make, including the value of any capital that you use to start. So let's say, for example, you know that you have a high startup cost, okay? And you will make profit. It's just, you know, you're not going to make too much profit. Or I should say rather, you know, you're going to make money, but you're not sure if it'll be profitable. So what happens is you have several things, but the first of this is you have what's called the before tax cash flow, which is what is the value of my business cash flows based upon what I'm anticipating it will do. So you take your capital cost, you take your cost and benefits, and then you develop out what's called the before tax cash flow. Now you have to understand something about before tax cash flow. Before tax cash flow is just based upon any income, profits, etc., versus any cost. So you subtract out your cost. Now, when you have a long-term item, like let's say an item like a car or computers or a building, those are called depreciable items. And what a depreciable item does is it recognizes that you're not going to take all the cost value of those items in only 1 year. So like a car is usually about a 5-year depreciable item. So it'll recognize that over 5 years, the value of the car is going to be reduced as you use it up. And this is outside of regular maintenance. So in addition to that capital cost in the beginning, you can now depreciate those items, which further reduces what's called your taxable income. Okay? So are we okay there so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So you get your before tax cash flow, which is within every year. Then you figure out, based upon your depreciation, what your actual taxable income is. So taxable income is before tax cash flow minus depreciation. And you'll see it if you want, it's in here, but I'll explain how it goes. But anyway, so once you get that taxable income, it is possible that actually you will be in the black. It's possible. Okay.
Okay.
If you have, that's where I recommend a really good accountant, because you have a really good accountant, they'll figure out how to get you in the black when you start dealing with taxes. But I'll give you 2 scenarios. Okay, so the first scenario is, yeah, good depreciation, you actually make a profit in the first year or 2. It's not uncommon for businesses to lose money in the first year. So let's say that you have a good accountant, you're able to use the depreciation correctly, and you make profit, and you learn that I'm not in the red, I'm actually in the black when I consider the after-tax cash flow, which is basically the before tax cash flow minus any taxes. Okay?
Okay.
Now, if you're not making money though, which is again a common thing within the first year or 2, you may get money back from the IRS because you have overpaid basically based upon all the factors. It is possible, but usually that only is allowed for about 3 years, after which the IRS will start saying, hey, wait a minute, the purpose of a business is to make money, not to lose it. So what's going on? This is, and usually with the interesting, it's called, after 3 years, usually it started being called a hobby. But the point is that the difference between before tax and after tax can mean the difference between having a profitable business and a non-profitable business. And so if you're going that route, again, having a good account that can help you get in the black after taxes, that's the best way to go.
I see. All right. Thanks.
I hope that helped.
Yeah, it did.
And if you want to talk about it more, please feel free. We can talk about it other times too.
All right. All right. I appreciate that. That sounds good.
Others? You have some good questions here. I just haven't heard from Justine as much, or Peyton, or Cassandra, or Mark.
I think Justine's in the middle of work, so she's sort of multitasking, listening to this while doing her obligations.
Well, if any of you want to ask me outside, feel free, but I just want to make sure you guys are okay from what we got so far. Okay. Not sure if there's anything else, because I want to just give you the essence of this. And if any of you want to take the class, again, this is my class. Right now, I believe it's filled up, and usually I fill up every semester, but it'll count for one of your general eds. No problem, I'm just curious. Okay. But again, over 15 weeks, you learn a lot more about a lot of this other stuff. Interesting enough, I had some people actually learn how to do taxes, if I was correct, because they realized actually getting a tax license is not that expensive, and you can make some pretty decent bank out of it. Because if there's no more questions, I think we can end for the day. And then tomorrow, what I'll start talking about in terms of economic tools and the like is I will start talking more about how to put the two together, including, well, actually, it should be robust decision making. It should be this way. I can talk about robust decision making like tomorrow, and then we'll finish up our series here.
Before everybody leaves, I did post the first recording in our club Google Drive. It's going to be in the UWB 2122 folder. At least for the people here, I just want to share the link in the chat so that they have it. And I'll upload the second recording once it's done uploading onto my computer.
Okay, let's get you. And again, if you want to share the notebook on this, feel free. I'm just renaming this because I think I misnamed it by accident. But yeah, I just do this as a placeholder because it's really difficult to take 2 semester classes and kind of dump them together in an hour and a half.
Right. Like no matter how much you try to cram in, just simply it's never enough, right?
Yeah. Because at the end of the economic analysis class, I require my students to give me a final report that basically incorporates everything that we've done over the semester. And it can be really interesting because I get different reports with different solutions, and it's interesting to see how each one works.
I see.
Well, if there's nothing else, I guess we conclude then.
I think that's it then. Once again, I'd like to thank you for your time, Dr. Placencia. And tomorrow is about robust decision making, right?
Correct.
All right. So discussion
Take care.
done. No more questions. I think we're done here. Right?
Okay. Well, take care. I'll have a good afternoon. See you tomorrow. Hopefully. Bye.
Have a good day.